Hello there, my sleepy souls. Tonight, we journey through the forgotten story of Alice Brandon, the girl who could see everyone's future but lost her own past forever, when transformation erased every memory of the girl she had been before immortality claimed her. I pour so much into these videos, and there are days where I question myself. But then I read one of your lovely comments, and it keeps me going. I haven't reached my goal of 1,000 subscribers yet, but I'm still fighting for it. If you want to support a small creator who truly cares about what she makes, it would mean the world if you subscribed. Thank you. Alright, let's settle in. Close your eyes. Let's get back to Alice's journeys and let her forgotten story carry you gently into rest. Mary Alice Brandon was born in 1901 in Biloxi, Mississippi. During the first year of the 20th century, when the New Age promised progress and prosperity, and when the Victorian era's strict propriety was giving way slowly to modern sensibilities that would reshape American society across the coming decades. Her father was a successful merchant and trader, whose business interests connected him to shipping concerns along the Gulf Coast, and whose reputation in Biloxi society depended on maintaining appearance of respectability and maintaining connections with other wealthy families who controlled commerce and controlled social access in the small coastal city. Her mother was a society woman, whose entire existence revolved around managing the household and managing the family's social position through careful cultivation of relationships with other prominent families and through meticulous attention to appearances and proprieties that governed upper middle class life in the early 1900s South. The Brandon family lived in comfortable Victorian house in one of Biloxi's better neighborhoods, where wealthy merchants and successful professionals maintained homes that reflected their prosperity through architectural details and through manicured gardens, and through the presence of servants who managed daily operations and who freed the family to focus on business and social concerns that mattered in their world. The house had proper parlor for receiving guests and had dining room large enough for elaborate dinner parties, and had bedrooms upstairs where the family slept and where the children were expected to remain quiet and well behaved when guests were visiting downstairs. The servants included cook and housemaid and occasionally gardener, when the grounds required more attention than the family could provide themselves. The presence of domestic help being marker of status and being necessary for maintaining the household in proper condition for social events and for unexpected visitors who might call during acceptable afternoon hours. Mary Alice was the firstborn child and the eldest daughter. Her arrival in 1901, creating joy for her parents, who had hoped for a healthy child, and who found themselves blessed with infant, whose delicate features and whose bright eyes suggested she would grow into beauty that would serve the family well when the time came for advantageous marriage that would connect the Brandons to even more prominent families. Her mother named her Mary Alice after her own mother and after beloved aunt, the double name common in Southern families where naming patterns honored previous generations and where family connections were reinforced through repetition of ancestral names across time. From her earliest moments, Mary Alice was subject to her mother's careful management and her mother's ambitious plans for her future. The infant daughter representing investment in family's continued social advancement and representing opportunity to elevate the Brandon name through eventual marriage into old money families whose ancestry predated the Brandons' more recent commercial success. Her sister Cynthia was born approximately 3 or 4 years after Mary Alice's birth, the second daughter arriving sometime around 1904 or 1905 when Mary Alice was old enough to understand that she now had sibling and had responsibility as older sister to set proper example and to help guide her younger sister through childhood. Cynthia's arrival shifted family dynamics slightly. The attention that had been focused entirely on Mary Alice now divided between 2 daughters who would both need careful grooming for their eventual roles as wives to suitable husbands from respectable families. But Mary Alice retained her position as eldest and retained the particular pressure that came with being firstborn daughter in family, where social advancement depended partly on the daughter's abilities to attract appropriate suitors when they reached marriageable age. The early years of Mary Alice's childhood were characterized by privilege and by structure. Her days organized around routines that prepared young girls for their futures as wives and mothers and as managers of their own households. She had the finest clothing that her parents well could purchase, her mother dressing her carefully for church services and for social events and for visits to other families' homes, where appearances mattered and where every detail of dress and deportment was noticed and was judged by other mothers who were evaluating the Brandon family's suitability for continued association. She attended children's activities organized by the church and organized by her mother's social circle, the carefully supervised gatherings providing opportunities for children of similar social standing to interact under watchful eyes of mothers who were already calculating future alliances and future marriages that might connect their families beneficially. But even in early childhood, Mary Alice demonstrated difference that her parents initially found charming, but that would eventually become source of deep concern and deep shame as the difference became more pronounced and became more undeniable. She had intuitions that seemed uncanny to the adults around her, her ability to know things before they happened manifesting in small ways that could be dismissed as lucky guesses or as remarkably perceptive observations from an unusually intelligent child. She would know when her father would arrive home from business trips with accuracy that exceeded normal childhood anticipation. Her presence at the window looking out toward the street beginning precisely when his carriage would turn the corner, even when his arrival time had not been specified, and even when weather or business concerns might have delayed his return. She would predict visitors before they knocked on the door, announcing to her mother that Mrs. Johnson or Mrs. Reed was coming to call moments before the knock would sound, and moments before the servant would answer to find exactly the visitor that Mary Alice had named. The servants noticed her strangeness before her parents fully acknowledged it. Their whispered conversations in the kitchen and in the hallways referring to the strange child and to the knowing eyes that seemed to see through people and to see beyond the present moment into futures that had not yet arrived. They found her unsettling despite her delicate beauty and despite her generally pleasant demeanor. The disconnect between her childish appearance and her uncanny knowledge creating discomfort that made them avoid her when possible and made them cross themselves or mutter prayers when she made predictions that proved accurate. Her mother dismissed the servants' superstitions as ignorance and as foolishness, the upper-class contempt for lower-class beliefs making her unwilling to credit their concerns about Mary, Alice's peculiar abilities, even when those abilities became increasingly difficult to explain through normal childhood perceptiveness. Her predictions about weather were particularly notable. Her announcements that rain was coming, or that storms were approaching, proving accurate hours before clouds appeared, and hours before barometric pressure dropped in ways that adults might have noticed if they had been paying attention to subtle environmental cues. She would know which dress her mother would choose for social events before her mother had made conscious decision. Her comments about the blue dress with the lace collar being met with surprise when her mother selected exactly that dress from her wardrobe moments later. She knew which playmates would be present at gatherings before arriving. Her statements about who would and would not attend proving correct when the actual attendance matched her predictions exactly. The examples accumulated across her early childhood, each incident individually explicable as coincidence or as lucky guess, but collectively suggesting pattern that defied normal explanation and that suggested abilities beyond what human children typically possessed. Around age 8 or 9, the visions that had manifested as gentle intuitions and as accurate guesses began to intensify and began to take forms that could no longer be dismissed as normal childhood perceptiveness or as fortunate coincidences that required no supernatural explanation. Mary Alice began to experience what her mother called spells and what her father called episodes, the moments when her eyes would go distant and her body would go still, and her attention would focus entirely on something invisible to everyone around her. During these episodes, she would see futures with clarity and with detail that exceeded her previous vague intuitions, the visions showing her specific events and specific outcomes with precision that made denial impossible when the predicted events occurred exactly as she had described them during her trances. She saw accidents before they occurred, her visions showing her neighbor's carriage overturning on specific corner and showing her the injuries that would result from the crash. She tried to warn her mother, tried to explain what she had seen, but her warnings were dismissed as nightmare or as product of overactive imagination that young girls sometimes developed when they spend too much time reading sensational stories or listening to servants' gossip. When the accident occurred 3 days later exactly as Mary Alice had described, her mother's face went pale and her father's expression became troubled, the undeniable accuracy of her prediction forcing them to acknowledge that their daughter's abilities exceeded normal explanation and exceeded comfortable boundaries of what respectable families could tolerate in their children. The disturbing nature of her visions increased as she grew older. The futures she saw including deaths and losses and tragedies that she could not prevent and could not change, despite knowing they were coming. She saw elderly neighbor's death from heart failure days before it occurred. The vision showing her the man's collapse and showing her his family's grief with detail that made her weep, even though the death had not yet happened in present reality. She saw fires and saw illnesses and saw financial failures. Her precognitive awareness extending beyond her immediate family into the broader community, whose futures unfolded before her inner sight, whether she wanted to see them or not. The burden of knowing terrible futures, while being powerless to change them, weighed on her increasingly. The child who should have been carefree and joyful, instead carrying knowledge that adults would have struggled to bear, and that children should never have to carry alone. Her parents' response to her growing abilities shifted from charm to concern, to active attempts at suppression, as the social implications of having a daughter with supernatural abilities became apparent in community, where superstition and religious belief made unexplainable phenomena threatening rather than interesting. They began telling her to stop making up stories and to stop seeking attention through elaborate predictions that upset people and that made the Brandon family seem strange or seem touched by forces that respectable families should not acknowledge. Her mother's increasing anxiety about social consequences overshadowed any maternal concern about what Mary Alice herself was experiencing, the focus shifting from the child's well-being to the family's reputation and to the potential damage that Mary Alice's strangeness might inflict on Cynthia's future prospects when the time came for Cynthia to enter society and to attract a suitable husband. The isolation began gradually as other children and other families noticed that Mary Alice was different and was unsettling in ways that made normal childhood friendships difficult and made social integration impossible, despite her family's wealth and despite her own gentle nature. She would know things about other children that they had not shared. Her comments about their secrets or their futures making them uncomfortable and making them avoid her during social gatherings. She would predict outcomes of games before they were played. Her certainty about results making other children unwilling to include her, because her presence removed uncertainty and removed the pleasure of not knowing how things would unfold. The other girls began whispering about her when they thought she could not hear. Their speculation about whether she was touched by God or touched by devil, creating division between those who found her fascinating and those who found her frightening. Mary Alice's transition into adolescence during the years from 1913 through 1917 brought intensification of her visions and brought corresponding intensification of her isolation from normal social life that girls of her age and social class were expected to enjoy and were expected to navigate successfully on their paths toward eventual marriage and toward establishment of their own households. The teenage years that should have been filled with parties and with courtship rituals and with gradual preparation for adult responsibilities instead became years of increasing alienation as her abilities made her incomprehensible to her peers and made her threatening to families who heard rumors about the Brandon girl, who saw things that hadn't yet happened and who made predictions that proved disturbingly accurate when time revealed the truth of her visions. The world beyond Biloxi was changing dramatically during these years. The Great War beginning in Europe in 1914 and creating anxiety throughout American society, even before the United States entered the conflict in 1917. Mary Alice saw the war's casualties in her visions long before news reached Biloxi, through newspapers and through telegrams that arrived at homes where sons and brothers and husbands had enlisted to fight in distant trenches. She would see specific deaths of young men from Biloxi families, her visions showing her their faces and their fates weeks before the official notifications arrived to devastate parents who had been hoping for their sons' safe returns. Her attempts to warn families were met with horror and with accusations that she was cursing the soldiers or was somehow causing their deaths through speaking of them. The magical thinking that pervaded even educated society, making people believe that prophecy and causation were connected, and that Mary Alice's knowledge somehow created the tragedies rather than simply foreseeing them. The social events that teenage girls attended became torture for Mary Alice rather than pleasure. Her presence at gatherings creating discomfort among other attendees who found her intensity disturbing and who found her knowledge unsettling when she would make casual comments that revealed futures people had not shared with her and had not wanted known. The girls' schools and the church socials and the carefully chaperoned parties that provided opportunities for young people to interact under watchful supervision of adults became occasions where Mary Alice's difference was most apparent and most problematic. She would know which girls were secretly courting which boys before the relationships became public. Her casual mentions of future engagements or future heartbreaks, making the other girls view her as witch or as devil's instrument, rather than as potential friend or as harmless eccentric, whose strangeness could be tolerated for the sake of her family's social position. Her knowledge of other girls' secrets made friendship impossible, because trust could not exist when Mary Alice knew everything without being told, and when her visions revealed betrayals and revealed disappointments before they occurred in present reality. She would know when girls were lying about their activities or were breaking rules that society imposed on young women's behavior. Her awareness of their deceptions visible in her expressions, even when she tried to hide what she knew. The other girls sensed her knowledge and resented her for it, their discomfort manifesting as exclusion and as cruel comments about her strangeness, and as deliberate attempts to make her feel unwelcome at gatherings where her family status required her invitation, but where her actual presence was unwanted by everyone who had to interact with her. The boys who should have been potential suitors found her beautiful and found her fascinating, but also found her frightening in ways that prevented normal courtship from developing, despite her family's wealth, making her attractive match for ambitious young men seeking advantageous marriages. Her delicate features and her unusual eyes attracted male attention, but her intensity and her uncanny knowledge repelled them when they realized that she could see through their pretenses and could see their futures in ways that made normal romantic deception impossible. She would know when boys were being insincere in their compliments or were pursuing her only for her family's money rather than for genuine affection. Her awareness of their true motivations making her unable to play the games that courtship required, and making her unable to pretend ignorance of realities that other girls either did not perceive or chose to overlook in pursuit of marriage and in pursuit of escape from their parents' homes. The visions themselves became more vivid and more frequent, As Mary Alice moved through her teenage years, the ability that had been manageable in childhood becoming overwhelming as adolescence intensified her precognitive powers and intensified her awareness of futures she could not change and could not prevent despite knowing exactly what was coming. She saw deaths with terrible clarity, the visions showing her not just the fact of death, but the specific circumstances and the specific suffering that preceded it. She saw neighbor woman's death from cancer months before the illness manifested in symptoms that doctors could detect. The vision of the woman's deterioration and the woman's pain haunting Mary Alice, while she was forced to maintain normal social interactions with someone she knew was already dying, even though present reality showed no evidence of the disease that would kill her. She saw financial disasters before they occurred, her visions showing her which families would lose their fortunes and which businesses would fail and which reputations would be destroyed by scandals that had not yet erupted into public knowledge. She saw marriages that would end in divorce or in tragedy. Her awareness of other families' private futures, making social interactions exhausting when she had to pretend, ignorance of things she knew with absolute certainty. She saw betrayals and saw losses and saw disappointments. The accumulated weight of tragic knowledge creating burden that would have been difficult for mature adult to carry, and that was impossible for teenage girl to bear without support or without understanding from people who could comprehend what she was experiencing. Her family's response to her abilities became increasingly desperate as the social consequences of having strange daughter became undeniable and became threatening to the family's position in Biloxi society. Her father's business began suffering as clients and partners heard rumors about his daughter's unnatural abilities and began questioning whether association with the Brandon family was wise when supernatural taint might attach to anyone who maintained close relationships with them. Her mother's social circle contracted as other women became uncomfortable with her presence and became unwilling to include her in gatherings where Mary Alice might appear and might make predictions or might reveal secrets that should remain hidden. The invitations that had once been numerous became rare and then stopped altogether. The Brandon family's social isolation growing in direct proportion to Mary Alice's inability to hide her abilities or to conform to expectations of normal behavior that her visions made impossible to maintain. Cynthia's position became particularly precarious as she reached age where courtship should have begun and where her family's connections should have provided opportunities for meeting suitable young men from respectable families. But the whispers about her older sister and the speculation about whether strangeness ran in the Brandon bloodline made eligible suitors hesitant to pursue Cynthia, despite her own normalcy, and despite her beauty, and despite her family's wealth that should have made her attractive prospect for marriage. Cynthia's growing resentment of Mary Alice was palpable and was justified from Cynthia's perspective, the younger sister's entire future being damaged by association with older sister, whose abilities she did not understand and whose problems she had not created, but for which she was being punished through social exclusion that threatened to leave her unmarried and unmarriageable. The distance between the sisters grew throughout their teenage years as Cynthia recognized that her own prospects depended on separating herself from Mary Alice's reputation and on convincing Biloxi society that she was normal despite her sister's strangeness. At social events, Cynthia would deny knowing Mary Alice well, or would minimize their relationship in attempts to protect her own social position. She would join other girls in their cruel comments about Mary Alice's oddness, the sisterly bond that should have existed sacrificed on altar of social survival and on altar of Cynthia's entirely reasonable desire for normal life that Mary Alice's presence threatened to make impossible. The betrayal was painful for Mary Alice, who understood through her visions that Cynthia's rejection was pragmatic rather than malicious, but who still felt the wound of familial abandonment, and who still suffered from the knowledge that even her own sister found her too strange and too dangerous to acknowledge publicly. Her parents' attempts to make her act normal intensified as the social consequences became more severe, and as their desperation to salvage family reputation grew stronger than their concern for Mary Alice's well-being or their interest in understanding what she was experiencing. They tried discipline and tried punishment, their methods ranging from lectures about proper behavior to restrictions on her activities to periods of isolation in her room when her predictions had caused particular embarrassment or had created particular problems for families' social standing. They consulted with their pastor about whether prayer and religious instruction might cure her of the visions, or might at least teach her to suppress them in public settings where her abilities created scandal and created suspicion about the family's spiritual state. The consultations with doctors began when Mary Alice was around 15 or 16, her parents seeking medical explanations for her abilities and seeking medical solutions that might eliminate the visions or might at least reduce their frequency and reduce their accuracy to levels that could be dismissed as normal intuition rather than as supernatural foresight. The doctors who examined her had no framework for understanding precognition and had no treatments for abilities that exceeded medical science's comprehension of human consciousness and human perception. Their diagnoses reflected the limited understanding of women's mental health that characterized early 20th century medicine. Their theories ranging from hysteria to overactive imagination, to attention-seeking behavior that could be corrected through proper discipline and through removal of whatever environmental factors were encouraging her to continue her disturbing claims. The medical theories of the time attributed many women's problems to fundamental weaknesses in female constitution and to moral failings that manifested as physical or mental symptoms requiring treatment or requiring confinement to protect both the afflicted women and the society around them from consequences of their conditions. Mary Alice was subjected to examinations that were humiliating and invasive, the male doctors treating her as specimen rather than as person, and treating her visions as symptoms of disease rather than as genuine abilities that might require different explanatory frameworks than conventional medicine provided. The suggested treatments ranged from rest cures that would isolate her from stimulation to dietary restrictions that would supposedly calm her nerves, to cold baths and to other interventions that reflected more superstition than science, despite being prescribed by educated medical professionals. The breaking point came when Mary Alice was approximately 16 or 17 years old, sometime around 1917 or 1918, when the cumulative effect of years of isolation and years of family pressure and years of social rejection had worn away her resilience and had worn away her hope that anyone would ever understand her or would ever accept her abilities as anything other than curse or sickness requiring elimination. The specific vision that precipitated the final crisis was major prediction that proved undeniably accurate in ways that could not be dismissed or could not be explained away as coincidence or as lucky guess, based on observation and based on normal human perceptiveness. The vision that sealed Mary Alice's fate came with terrible clarity and with terrible specificity. Her precognitive sight, showing her death of prominent Biloxi citizen in circumstances so detailed and so precise that no one could dismiss her prediction as vague intuition or as general anxiety about person's health. She saw Mr. Harrison, respected banker and pillar of community, suffering fatal heart attack in his office on specific Tuesday afternoon in early 1918. The vision showing her exact position of his body when he would collapse, an exact expression on his face when death would claim him, and exact words his secretary would scream when she discovered him slumped over his desk. Mary Alice told her mother about the vision 3 days before the predicted death. Her desperate attempts to warn someone and to perhaps prevent the tragedy overriding her learned caution about speaking of futures she had seen. Her mother forbade her from mentioning the vision to anyone outside the family, the social consequences of such prediction being too severe to contemplate when the Harrisons were among Biloxi's most prominent families and when accusing their patriarch of imminent death would be interpreted as curse or as malicious attack on respected man's reputation. But Mary Alice's distress was visible to servants and was visible to visitors who noticed her agitation and who asked questions that led her to speak of what she had seen, despite her mother's explicit instructions to remain silent. When Mr. Harrison died exactly as Mary Alice had predicted on exactly the Tuesday afternoon she had specified, and in exactly the circumstances she had described, the reaction from Biloxi society was immediate and was devastating to the Brandon family's remaining social standing. Some community members whispered that Mary Alice had caused the death through speaking of it, their belief in sympathetic magic making them view her prediction as curse that had brought about the very tragedy it had foretold. Others claimed she must have had evil knowledge from demonic sources, their religious framework making supernatural foresight evidence of devil's influence rather than evidence of unusual human ability that might have natural explanation beyond current scientific understanding. Still others simply feared her as witch or as person touched by forces beyond normal human comprehension, their fear making them avoid the Brandon family entirely and making them warn their own children to stay away from the girl who knew things she should not know and who spoke of deaths before they occurred. The social ostracism was complete and was catastrophic for family, whose position depended on maintaining relationships with other prominent families and whose business interests required trust and required cooperation from community members who now viewed them with suspicion and with fear. Her father's banking contacts withdrew their business, his partners suggesting dissolution of agreements that had been profitable, but that now seemed tainted by association with family, whose daughter had predicted Harrison's death so accurately that supernatural explanation seemed more plausible than natural one. Her mother was cut completely from social circles that had been her entire world, the invitations ceasing and the former friends crossing the street to avoid speaking to her when they encountered her in public spaces. Cynthia's marriage prospects evaporated entirely as eligible young men made clear they would not consider alliance with family marked by such strangeness and marked by such scandal. The young woman, who should have been preparing for engagement and for wedding, instead faced future of spinsterhood and of continued association with family, whose reputation had been destroyed by her older sister's abilities. Her resentment of Mary Alice became open hostility, the sisterly relationship completely severed by the recognition that Mary Alice's existence was preventing Cynthia from having any of the normal life experiences that young women of her class expected, and that she deserved to enjoy without being punished for circumstances beyond her control. The family conferences about what to do with Mary Alice occurred behind closed doors, but were audible to the girl whose supernatural hearing perhaps allowed her to perceive conversations she was not meant to hear, or whose visions perhaps showed her what was being decided about her future, even before the decisions were finalized. Her father consulted with doctors and with lawyers about options for managing daughter, whose presence was destroying family's livelihood and destroying family's social position beyond any hope of recovery. The solutions proposed all involved removing Mary Alice from Biloxi society and removing her from situations where her visions could cause further damage to family reputation and could cause further harm to Cynthia's diminishing chances of making acceptable marriage. The asylum was presented as rest facility, where Mary Alice could receive treatment for her condition and could be cared for by medical professionals who specialized in nervous disorders and in female hysteria that characterized so many women's commitments to institutional care during early 20th century. Her father explained that the separation would be temporary and would be therapeutic. His assurances that she would return home once she was cured ringing hollow. When Mary Alice's visions showed her the truth of what was being planned and showed her that the commitment would be permanent rather than temporary and would be abandonment rather than treatment. Her mother cried while agreeing to the commitment, the tears genuine but insufficient to prevent her from participating in decision that would condemn her daughter to institutional life for sake of preserving Cynthia's future and for sake of salvaging whatever remained of family's social position. The legal process of committing family member to asylum in 1918 or 1919 required only father's signature and only doctor's assessment that the person posed a danger to themselves or to others or suffered from condition requiring institutional supervision. Mary Alice's visions and her accurate predictions were framed as delusions and as evidence of mental instability that required professional intervention in controlled environment where she could not harm herself through her fixation on morbid prophecies and could not harm others through spreading predictions that caused distress and caused social disruption. No one asked Mary Alice whether she consented to commitment. Her legal status as unmarried woman under her father's authority, making her consent irrelevant to process that would deprive her of freedom and would separate her from family and from any hope of normal future. The journey to the asylum happened on cold morning in early 1919, when Mary Alice was approximately 17 or 18 years old. Her exact age uncertain, because records would later be lost or destroyed, and because her own memory of her human life would be completely erased by transformation that awaited her in the institutional walls where she would spend her final human months. She was given sedative to calm her protests and to make the journey easier for her father, who accompanied her in automobile or in carriage, depending on distance to facility and depending on transportation available in that era when cars were becoming common, but were not yet universal. Her last glimpses of freedom included trees bare from winter, and sky grey with clouds and birds flying overhead in patterns that seemed symbolic of liberty she was losing and of confinement that awaited her behind institutional walls. The asylum building was an imposing structure designed more for security than for comfort, its architecture reflecting purpose of containing people who were deemed unable to function in normal society, and who required supervision to protect themselves and to protect others from their conditions. The windows had bars that were visible even from distance, the metal grills making clear that this was prison as much as hospital, and that the patients inside were not free to leave regardless of whether they believed themselves cured or believed themselves unjustly committed. The high walls surrounded the grounds, the perimeter designed to prevent escapes and designed to separate the institutional world from the normal world beyond, where people lived ordinary lives and enjoyed freedoms that asylum residents had forfeited through their commitments. The intake process stripped Mary Alice of her remaining dignity and stripped her of her identity as individual with preferences and with history beyond the diagnosis that had brought her to the asylum. Her possessions were removed and were catalogued. The personal items that connected her to her life outside reduced to list in ledger that recorded what little she had been allowed to bring with her. Her clothing was replaced with institutional garments that were shapeless and were identical to what every other female patient wore, the uniformity eliminating individual expression and eliminating visible markers of social class or of personal taste. She was entered into registry as Mary Alice Brandon, age 17 or 18. Diagnosis: hysteria and delusional disorder. Committed by father for treatment of condition, characterized by false prophecies and by fixation on morbid predictions that caused distress to patient and to those around her. Her father's departure was brief and was final, his discomfort with the situation visible in his hurried goodbye and in his refusal to meet her eyes when she begged him to reconsider and to take her home. He promised he would visit, but his expression showed the lie, his intention being to sever connection with daughter, whose existence had become liability and whose continued presence in family life threatened to complete the destruction of their social position and threatened to eliminate completely Cynthia's chances of escaping unmarried fate. The door locked behind him with sound that marked transition from temporary separation to permanent abandonment, the click of the lock more final than any words could have been, and more devastating than any explicit rejection would have been, because it represented physical severing of her connection to world outside and to family who had chosen their reputation over their daughter. The ward where Mary Alice was placed contained rows of beds separated by minimal space. The lack of privacy absolute and the lack of personal territory complete in an environment where dozens of women lived in single large room under constant supervision of staff who viewed them as problems requiring management rather than as people requiring care. The other patients represented cross-section of women who'd been deemed unsuitable for normal society, their diagnoses ranging from genuine mental illness to simple inconvenience to families who wanted them removed from daily life. Some women had been committed for depression that made them unable to fulfill domestic duties, others for defying husbands or for expressing opinions that men in their lives found threatening or found unacceptable. Some were genuinely ill and genuinely needed care that families could not provide, while others were simply different or simply difficult in ways that early 20th century society had no tolerance for and no framework for accommodating outside institutional walls. The daily routines in the asylum were rigid and were enforced without flexibility or without consideration for individual needs or individual preferences. The institutional schedule designed to manage large numbers of patients with minimal staff and with minimal resources. Waking bells rang at dawn, regardless of whether patients had slept well, or had been kept awake by nightmares or by the sounds of other patients' distress in the communal sleeping space. Breakfast was served at specific time and consisted of institutional food that was bland and was often insufficient for the appetites of women who had no other source of nutrition and no other pleasure in their restricted lives. The meals were eaten in supervised dining hall, where conversation was monitored, and where any behavior deemed disruptive or deemed inappropriate could result in punishment or in isolation. The days were filled with enforced idleness, punctuated by brief periods of supervised activity that were supposed to provide therapeutic benefit, but that mostly served to occupy time and to prevent patients from becoming restless or from causing disruptions that would require staff intervention. The women sat in day rooms with minimal stimulation and minimal entertainment, the asylum providing no books and no paper and no activities that might engage their minds or might provide genuine therapeutic value. The boredom was crushing and was intended to be docile-making. The lack of mental stimulation designed to reduce patients' energy and to reduce their capacity for resistance or for questioning their confinement. Mary Alice's visions continued within the asylum walls despite her hopes that perhaps the institutional environment would somehow suppress her abilities or would somehow cure her of the gift that had destroyed her life and had led to her commitment. The visions intensified rather than diminishing. Her precognitive sight, showing her futures of other patients and futures of staff members and futures of events that would occur within the asylum and beyond its walls. She saw which patients would die and which would be transferred to other facilities and which would eventually be released to families who had reconsidered their commitments or who had decided that the financial burden of institutional care was no longer sustainable. She saw the fates of women who shared her ward, their futures unfolding before her inner sight with same terrible clarity that had characterized her visions throughout her life. The torture of seeing tragedies she could not prevent continued in institutional setting, just as it had continued in her free life. The knowledge of impending deaths and impending suffering creating burden that was magnified by her inability to warn anyone or to take any action that might alter the future she foresaw. She attempted to warn other patients about upcoming treatments or about approaching deaths. Her compassionate desire to prepare them for what was coming, overriding her learned caution about speaking of her visions. But her warnings were reported to staff by frightened patients who did not understand her intentions and who viewed her predictions as threats rather than as attempts to help. The reports leading to punishments that were designed to suppress her behavior and to teach her that speaking about her visions would result in consequences more severe than simply being disbelieved. The treatments available in early 1920s asylums reflected the limited understanding of mental illness and reflected the often brutal approaches that characterized institutional psychiatry during an era when patient welfare was secondary to maintaining order and maintaining control over populations of people who were viewed as fundamentally different from normal humans and fundamentally unreachable through conventional therapeutic methods. Mary Alice was subjected to cold baths that were supposed to shock her system into normalcy, the immersion in frigid water lasting until her skin turned blue and until her body shook uncontrollably from hypothermia that staff viewed as therapeutic rather than as torture. She was placed in isolation chambers when her visions led her to speak about futures that frightened other patients or that disturbed staff members who found her predictions unsettling even when they claimed not to believe her abilities were real. The restraints were used when staff deemed her behavior too disruptive or too difficult to manage through verbal commands alone, the leather straps binding her to bed or to chair for hours or for days at a time until she learned to suppress her visible reactions to visions, and until she learned to maintain appearance of normalcy regardless of what horrors she was seeing in futures that approached inevitably. The physical restrictions were accompanied by sedatives that dulled her consciousness and dulled her awareness of her surroundings, the medications making her compliant and making her docile in ways that pleased staff who preferred patients who required minimal supervision and minimal intervention. But the sedatives could not eliminate her visions completely, the precognitive ability persisting even through chemical fog and even through the haze that made her present reality feel distant and feel less substantial than the futures she continued to see despite the treatments designed to eliminate her symptoms. The years in the asylum blurred together into monotonous repetition of the same days and the same routines and the same faces of staff and patients who became familiar through constant proximity, but who never became friends or became true companions because genuine connection was impossible in an environment where everyone was damaged and where everyone was struggling simply to survive their confinement. Mary Alice aged from teenager to young woman within institutional walls, her 19th birthday and her 20th birthday passing without acknowledgement and without celebration in place, where individual identities were subsumed into collective category of patients who existed to be managed rather than to be cared for as people with histories and with futures beyond their diagnoses. Time became meaningless in the unchanging institutional environment where seasons changed outside barred windows, but where internal reality remained constant and remained oppressive regardless of whether sunshine or rain fell on the asylum grounds. 1919 became 1920 became 1921. The years marked only by occasional transfers of patients and by occasional arrivals of new commitments and by the deaths that occurred regularly enough to be routine rather than to be shocking in facility, where many residents were elderly or were suffering from conditions that would eventually prove fatal. Mary Alice watched through her visions as her family continued their lives without her. As Cynthia eventually married respectably after sufficient time had passed for the scandal of Mary Alice's commitment to fade into background, and for the family's reputation to partially recover through her permanent absence, she saw her parents aging and saw their relief at having solved the problem of their strange daughter through institutional commitment that removed her from their daily lives and removed her from their social concerns. She saw that they never intended to retrieve her and never intended to bring her home, regardless of whether she showed improvement or showed cure from the condition they believed afflicted her. The knowledge that her commitment was permanent rather than temporary, and that her family had truly abandoned her rather than temporarily separating from her for therapeutic purposes, should have been devastating. But Mary Alice found that she had already mourned the loss of her family during the early months of her confinement, and that learning the truth of their intentions brought clarity rather than bringing fresh grief. The peculiar friendship that developed between Mary Alice and one particular asylum worker provided the only genuine human connection she experienced during her years of confinement. The relationship offering brief respite from isolation and offering proof that not everyone viewed her as simply diagnosis or simply problem requiring management. The worker was an older woman who had seen too many unjustly committed patients and who had developed skepticism about the diagnoses that brought women to the asylum and about the treatments that were supposed to cure them, but that mostly served to break their spirits and to eliminate their resistance to institutional authority. This woman recognized that Mary Alice was different from the genuinely mentally ill patients and recognized that her commitment had been social convenience rather than medical necessity. The girl's abilities being unusual rather than being evidence of insanity or being evidence of condition requiring confinement. The small kindnesses this worker provided were meaningful beyond proportion to their actual substance. The extra blanket during cold nights and the sympathetic words during difficult moments representing acknowledgement of Mary Alice's humanity and representing recognition that she deserved compassion rather than deserving only the clinical detachment that characterize most staff interactions with patients. The whispered conversations in hallways or during treatments provided Mary Alice with someone who would listen when she spoke of her visions, without immediately dismissing her or without reporting her words to supervisors who would order punishments or would order additional treatments designed to suppress her symptoms. This woman perhaps had her own doubts about the asylum system, and perhaps had her own questions about whether the institution was truly helping patients or was simply warehousing people who were inconvenient to families and to society that had no tolerance for difference and no capacity for accommodating people whose minds worked differently from the accepted norm. The relationship provided Mary Alice with fragile hope that perhaps not all humans viewed her as monster or as problem, that perhaps somewhere beyond asylum walls there existed people who might understand her abilities and might accept her despite her strangeness. But the tragedy came when this worker eventually left the asylum through resignation or through transfer to another facility or through death that Mary Alice perhaps had foreseen but had been unable to prevent. The loss left Mary Alice utterly alone again, with only her visions for company. The brief period of human connection making the return to complete isolation more painful than it would have been if she had never experienced the friendship at all. James the tracker vampire had been hunting in Mississippi and in surrounding states for years before his attention focused specifically on Mary Alice Brandon. His methodology involving selecting hunting grounds where disappearances would not be investigated thoroughly and where deaths could be attributed to natural causes or to accidents rather than to predatory vampire whose existence would threaten the secrecy that vampire survival required. Asylums represented perfect hunting territory for vampires who understood that patients died regularly in institutional care, and that deaths of committed individuals rarely prompted intensive investigation or prompted questions from families who had already severed emotional ties through the act of commitment itself. James had been feeding from asylum populations for decades. His kills carefully managed to appear natural, and his selection of victims calculated to avoid patterns that might alert even negligent authorities to supernatural presence in their midst. His discovery of Mary Alice was accident of proximity rather than result of deliberate search. His presence at the asylum during one of his periodic hunts, bringing him close enough to catch her scent, and close enough to recognize immediately that her blood appealed to him beyond normal human blood's appeal, and beyond the routine satisfaction that feeding provided to vampire, whose existence consisted primarily of hunting and of killing and of moving to new territories before patterns became noticeable. She was his singer, the phenomenon occurring perhaps once in 1,000 humans, where one person's blood called to specific vampire with intensity that exceeded normal thirst and that exceeded normal hunger in ways that made restraint nearly impossible, and that made the hunt more satisfying and more meaningful than routine feeding could ever be. The obsession that developed in James after discovering Mary Alice was characteristic of his nature as hunter, who valued the chase and valued the anticipation as much as he valued the actual kill. His methodology involving prolonged stalking that allowed him to study his prey and allowed him to plan deaths that would be memorable and would be satisfying in ways that quick kills could never provide. He began visiting the asylum grounds regularly under cover of darkness, his vampire nature allowing him to move unseen and allowing him to observe Mary Alice through barred windows as she slept or as she sat in day rooms during the endless hours of institutional routine. He learned her patterns and learned her routines, his knowledge of her schedule allowing him to plan exactly when and where he would take her and exactly how he would end her life in ways that would satisfy his desire for dramatic and meaningful kill, rather than simple feeding that would waste the rare gift of having found his singer. Mary Alice's visions showed her James before she ever consciously saw him in physical reality. Her precognitive sight revealing the blonde vampire with red eyes who watched her from shadows and who planned her death with meticulous attention to detail that would have been flattering if it had not been absolutely terrifying. She saw his face clearly in her visions and saw his approach and saw the exact moment when he would come for her and saw the specific manner of her death that he was planning with the care that artists might devote to masterpiece or that craftsman might devote to work that would define his legacy. The visions showed her his teeth at her throat and showed her blood spilling and showed her life ending in agony and in terror that would be magnified by her awareness through precognition that her death was approaching and that nothing she could do would prevent it from occurring exactly as she had foreseen. The absolute terror of seeing your own murder approaching with certainty was magnified by Mary Alice's institutional confinement that made escape impossible and that made seeking help futile when the staff would dismiss her warnings as delusions and would punish her for speaking about the monster who was stalking her. She tried to tell the workers about the man she saw in her visions, tried to describe his appearance and his intentions in hopes that perhaps someone would believe her or would at least increase security around the asylum in ways that might inadvertently prevent James from accessing her. But her descriptions of pale man with red eyes who planned to kill her were recorded in her file as evidence of worsening condition and as evidence that her delusions were becoming more elaborate and more concerning in ways that suggested she might require more intensive treatment, or might require transfer to facility with higher level of security and with more restrictive protocols. The vampire who worked at the asylum remains nameless in canon and remains mysterious in his motivations and in his history. His presence at the institution perhaps indicating that he was using the facility as hunting ground in the same way that James was using it, or perhaps indicating that he was attempting to exist among humans in some capacity that required regular employment and required maintaining cover as normal human worker. His awareness of James's stalking behavior came from recognizing another vampire's presence around the asylum grounds, and from recognizing the particular patterns that indicated James was hunting specific prey, rather than simply feeding opportunistically from available victims. The vampire worker's observation of Mary Alice revealed that she was the object of James's attention. The girl's visible fear and her apparent awareness of danger that others could not perceive, making her stand out among the patients who moved through their days in medicated hazes or in resigned acceptance of their institutional fates. His growing curiosity about this peculiar patient, who seemed to know she was being hunted, led him to pay closer attention to her behavior and led him to listen to staff discussions about her case and about her delusions involving the man who wanted to kill her. The descriptions she provided matched James's appearance closely enough that the vampire worker recognized she was somehow aware of the threat, even though normal humans should not have been able to perceive vampire presences, or should not have been able to anticipate vampire attacks before they occurred. His recognition that Mary Alice possessed some unusual ability beyond normal human perception created interest that went beyond simple curiosity, and that suggested she might be worth saving from James despite the risks that intervention would entail, and despite the vampire laws that forbade creating new vampires without permission from appropriate authorities. The moral calculation that the vampire worker performed involved weighing Mary Alice's certain death against the consequences of transforming her without authorization, and against the possibility that his intervention might provoke James's anger and might create larger problems than it would solve. The Volturi laws regarding unauthorized transformations were absolute and were enforced through execution of both the creator and the created vampire. The penalties designed to prevent proliferation of vampires and designed to maintain control over vampire population through centralized authority that determined who could be transformed and under what circumstances transformations could occur. But the vampire worker also recognized that Mary Alice would die regardless of whether he intervened, that James would kill her in the manner he had planned, and that her death would occur within days or within weeks based on James's stalking patterns and based on the intensity of his focus on his intended victim. The decision to save her formed gradually, rather than occurring in a single moment of clarity. The vampire worker's observations of Mary Alice revealing that she was different from other patients and that her commitment had been unjust and that her abilities deserved preservation even if preservation required transforming her into creature she had not chosen to become. Her precognitive ability was perceptible to him in ways he could not fully articulate. The sense that she knew things she should not know, and that she saw things she should not see, creating recognition that she possessed gift that might be valuable to vampire world, and that might justify the risks he was taking by intervening in James's hunt and by creating new vampire without authorization. The awareness that saving her would condemn her to immortal existence she had not requested and would condemn her to vampire nature she might not want was balanced against the certainty that allowing James to kill her would waste whatever potential her abilities represented and would waste the life of someone who had already suffered unjustly through her institutional confinement. Mary Alice's visions began showing her two possible futures diverging from the present moment, like branches splitting from tree trunk, one path leading to her death at James's hands, and the other path leading to transformation by the vampire worker, whose intervention would save her life by ending her humanity. The visions of transformation showed her the burning, and showed her the agony, and showed her the 3 days of suffering that would eclipse all previous pain she had experienced during her human life. But the visions also showed her survival, and showed her existence continuing beyond the moment when James had planned to end it. The choice between certain death and uncertain immortality making, transformation seemed preferable despite the horror of what the process would entail, and despite the complete unknown of what vampire existence would mean for someone whose humanity had already been so constrained by institutional confinement and by family abandonment. She began making eye contact with the vampire worker when their paths crossed in the asylum hallways, or when he was performing his duties in areas where she was present. Her attempts to communicate her awareness of his true nature and a desperate plea for him to save her visible in her expressions, even though she could not speak openly about what she knew without being overheard by staff who would interpret her words as further evidence of delusion. The vampire worker recognized her awareness and recognized her silent request for intervention, his own decision solidifying as he realized that she understood what he was and understood what transformation would mean, and was choosing immortality over death with as much informed consent as was possible given her circumstances, and given the limited time available before James would make his move, and would end her human life permanently. The night chosen for transformation was the same night that James had selected for Mary Alice's murder, the convergence of timelines creating urgency that required the vampire worker to act quickly and to act decisively before James could claim the prey he had been stalking for weeks. Mary Alice's visions showed her both vampires approaching simultaneously, their intentions opposed, but their goals both involving her death in different forms, one death being permanent ending, and the other death being transition into immortal existence that would preserve her consciousness and would preserve her abilities even while destroying her humanity and destroying any possibility of returning to normal human life. The vampire worker came to her room in the asylum during the night hours when staff supervision was minimal and when patient movements were restricted to sleeping areas where they could be monitored easily by skeleton crews who worked overnight shifts. His explanation of what he was about to do was brief and was honest. His acknowledgement that transformation would hurt and that she would lose her humanity balanced by his assurance that she would survive and that her existence would continue beyond the death that James had planned for her. Mary Alice's acceptance was immediate and was desperate. Her understanding through visions that this was her only chance at survival, making her willing to endure whatever pain transformation would require, and making her willing to accept whatever consequences vampire existence would entail. She did not fully understand what being vampire meant because her visions showed her futures, but did not explain the mechanics of vampire nature, or did not clarify the specific limitations and the specific capabilities that immortality would provide. But her acceptance was based on choosing life over death, and on choosing unknown future over certain ending that James represented. The bite came quickly and came precisely. The vampire worker's experience with transformations evident in his efficient placement of venom at neck and at wrists and at ankles, to ensure that venom would spread through her system rapidly and would reach her heart before death could become irreversible. The burning began immediately as venom entered her bloodstream, the fire spreading from the bite locations through her veins and through her arteries in waves of agony that eclipsed all previous pain, and that made the asylum treatments and the institutional suffering seem almost pleasant by comparison. Her screams began despite her attempts to remain quiet, the pain too intense and too all-consuming to allow for silence, or to allow for the control she'd learned during her years of suppressing visible reactions to her visions and to her circumstances. James arrived at the asylum moments after the transformation had begun, his timing perfect for the kill he had planned, but his timing too late to prevent the vampire worker's intervention that had already condemned Mary Alice to 3 days of burning transformation. His fury at being deprived of his prey was absolute and was visible in his expression when he discovered Mary Alice already transforming with venom spreading through her system, and with her human death already becoming inevitable through process he could not reverse and could not prevent from completing. The confrontation between James and the vampire worker was brief and was violent. Their opposed intentions regarding Mary Alice, creating conflict that might have resulted in one or both of their destructions if the situation had been different, or if the vampire worker had been less skilled at escaping or less experienced at avoiding fights. He could not win. The vampire worker's escape was successful, but his ultimate fate remains ambiguous in canon. His departure from the asylum leaving no clear record of whether he survived James's pursuit, or whether James eventually destroyed him in retaliation for interfering with the hunt, or whether he simply disappeared into vampire world and continued his existence elsewhere. James was forced to flee the asylum when staff began investigating the disturbance, and when his presence risked exposure that would threaten vampire secrecy and would bring Volturi attention that even James with his confidence and his skill would prefer to avoid. His rage at losing his singer and his determination to eventually destroy Mary Alice for denying him the kill he had anticipated created obsession that would persist across decades, and that would eventually lead to his own destruction when he attempted to claim another prize that had been protected by vampires more powerful than the asylum worker who had saved Mary Alice from his initial hunt. Mary Alice was left alone to complete her transformation in her asylum room or in the morgue, where staff had taken her body after discovering her apparently dead, and after assuming that the disturbance they had investigated had resulted in patient's death through means they could not immediately determine. The 3 days of burning that constitute vampire transformation were unwitnessed and were unassisted. her isolation during the process making the agony more terrible, because she had no one to explain what was happening, and no one to assure her that the pain would eventually end and that she would survive the fire that seemed to be consuming her from inside. The venom worked systematically through her body, transforming her cells and transforming her tissues into vampire consistency that would be stronger and would be more durable and would be immortal in ways that human body could never achieve. The memory loss that occurred during transformation was not immediate, but was progressive. The venom's effect on her brain destroying the neural pathways that contained her human memories and destroying the connections that formed her identity as Mary Alice Brandon, who had lived 18 or 19 years before her transformation. The faces of her parents dissolved from her memory, and the face of her sister Cynthia faded into nothing. The years of her childhood and the years of her adolescence and the months of her asylum confinement being erased systematically as venom rewrote her neural structure and eliminated the biological foundations that had supported her human consciousness and her human self-awareness. The trauma of her commitment and the trauma of her family's abandonment and the trauma of James's stalking were all erased along with every other memory. The mercy of forgetting balanced against the tragedy of losing every experience and every relationship and every moment that had constituted her existence before transformation. The burning concentrated in her heart during the final hours of transformation, the venom completing its work of stopping her heartbeat and completing its reorganization of her cardiovascular system into vampire configuration that would sustain her existence indefinitely without requiring the biological processes that had maintained her human life. Her heart beat its final beats and then stopped permanently, the silence in her chest marking transition from human to vampire and marking the completion of transformation that had destroyed Mary Alice Brandon and had created the creature who would eventually become Alice Cullen, but who woke with no knowledge of who she had been and with no understanding of what she had become. Awakening as vampire with no memory of human life was disorienting in ways that exceeded normal newborn confusion. The complete absence of identity and the complete absence of context making every sensation strange and making every moment feel disconnected from any foundation or any history that might have provided framework for understanding what she was experiencing. She opened her eyes to darkness that was not truly dark, because her vampire vision penetrated shadows and revealed details that human eyes could never have perceived. The asylum room or the morgue space where she had completed transformation visible with perfect clarity, despite the absence of artificial light. She did not know her name and did not know her age and did not know where she was or why she was there. The blankness in her memory absolute and terrifying in ways that would have caused panic if she had possessed enough sense of self to understand what she had lost. The first awareness that penetrated her confusion was the thirst, the burning in her throat, different from transformation burning, but equally demanding and equally impossible to ignore, when every instinct in her new body screamed for blood and screamed for sustenance that her vampire nature required and that her newborn intensity made overwhelming. She did not understand what the thirst meant or what would satisfy it, but instinct guided her movements as she stood and as she tested her new strength and as she discovered capabilities that exceeded anything human body could achieve. The asylum around her was filled with heartbeats, and filled with the scent of human blood that called to her thirst and that made her throat burn more intensely. The proximity of potential prey, triggering hunting instincts she did not consciously understand, but that her vampire nature provided automatically. Breaking free from the asylum required no planning and no strategy, because her newborn strength made doors and locks and walls merely temporary obstacles rather than true barriers to her movement. She moved through the building with speed that surprised her and with strength that allowed her to tear through restraints and through barriers that would have contained her human self permanently. The staff members she encountered scattered in terror when they saw her, their fear scent triggering her predatory responses and making her thirst intensify beyond what she could consciously control, even if she had understood that control was possible or was desirable. She escaped into the night without fully intending to escape, her body moving on instincts that her conscious mind could not direct or could not comprehend, when she had no framework for understanding what she was or what she was capable of doing. The first kills happened during those initial nights of freedom, when thirst drove her actions, and when newborn intensity made resistance impossible. Even though some part of her consciousness recognized that killing humans was wrong, and recognized that drinking their blood made her monster, rather than made her person deserving of existence or deserving of compassion. She hunted travelers and hunted isolated individuals whose disappearances would not be immediately noticed and would not be immediately investigated, her instincts guiding her toward prey that could be taken safely without creating patterns that would alert authorities to supernatural presence in their territory. The satisfaction of feeding was immediate and was overwhelming, the blood cooling her burning throat temporarily and providing sustenance that her vampire body required. But the satisfaction was followed immediately by horror and by self-loathing when the feeding frenzy ended, and when she could see what she had done to the human whose life she had ended. The visions that had characterized her human existence survived transformation and intensified through the change, her precognitive ability now extending to vampire futures as well as human futures, and now showing her possibilities and probabilities with clarity that exceeded her human vision's accuracy. She saw her own actions moments before she committed them, the visions showing her the humans she would kill and the manner of their deaths and the blood she would drink from their bodies. The horror of watching herself commit murder through precognitive sight before actually committing the murder in present reality created psychological torture that made each kill more terrible because she experienced it twice, once through vision and once through action. The doubling of experience making her fully aware of what she was doing and making her fully complicit in violence she could not seem to prevent despite knowing it was coming. Learning vampire abilities through trial and error without mentor or without guide was dangerous and was inefficient. Her discoveries about her own capabilities happening accidentally when circumstances forced her to use powers she did not know she possessed. She discovered her speed when pursuing prey that ran from her, her body moving faster than human eye could track and faster than she had consciously intended to move. She found her strength when she accidentally destroyed objects she touched with force she had not meant to apply. The vampire power making her dangerous to everything around her, until she learned control through painful process of breaking things and hurting people unintentionally before developing conscious restraint. The enhanced senses were overwhelming initially, every sound deafening and every scent vivid, and every sight too detailed and too clear for her to process comfortably, when her human brain's filtering mechanisms no longer functioned to protect her from sensory overload. The instinctive knowledge that she must hide what she was came without conscious understanding of why secrecy mattered or what consequences exposure would bring. Her vampire nature providing survival instincts that protected her, even when her conscious mind lacked the context or lacked the information that would have explained the need for caution. She learned to avoid sunlight without knowing why her skin sparkled in direct sun. The instinct to hide during daylight hours protecting her from revealing herself to humans who would have recognized that her diamond-like skin marked her as inhuman and marked her as threat requiring elimination or requiring investigation. She slept in abandoned buildings and in caves and in spaces where humans would not discover her during vulnerable daylight hours, when her sparkling skin would betray her nature and would threaten whatever safety her secrecy provided. The isolation of newborn existence without creator and without coven, and without any vampire companion to teach her or to guide her, was absolute and was crushing. The loneliness magnified by her lack of memory and by her lack of identity that made her feel disconnected from both vampire world and human world without belonging to either. She wandered through Mississippi and through Louisiana and through Alabama, moving restlessly through the South without destination and without purpose, beyond survival and beyond satisfying thirst that drove her from place to place in search of prey and in search of something she could not name because she had no memory of ever belonging anywhere or ever being part of anything larger than her solitary existence. The searching for identity became obsession that consumed her thoughts during moments when thirst was satisfied and when immediate survival concerns were addressed. Her desperate need to know who she had been and where she had come from creating pain that exceeded physical discomfort and that exceeded the moral anguish of her killings. She tried to use her precognitive visions to see backward into her own past, tried to force her ability to show her the human life she could not remember and the human identity she had lost during transformation. But the visions refused to show her own history, no matter how hard she concentrated or how desperately she pleaded with her gift to reveal what venom had erased. The precognition showing her only futures and showing her only other people's past, while keeping her own history completely hidden and completely inaccessible. The cruel irony of seeing everyone else's past and everyone else's future, while being unable to access her own memories, created unique torture that other vampires did not experience and that other vampires could not understand, because they remembered their human lives and remembered their families and remembered their transformations even when those memories were painful or were traumatic. She could see the complete life stories of humans she encountered, their births and their childhoods and their relationships and their deaths unfolding before her precognitive sight with perfect clarity. She could see vampires' entire histories through visions that showed her their transformations and their creators and their centuries of existence. But her own past remained blank and remained inaccessible, the missing foundation making her feel incomplete and making her feel like she had been created from nothing rather than having been human before becoming vampire. Returning to Biloxi area happened without conscious planning, her wandering eventually bringing her back to the region where she had been human and where she had been transformed, even though she had no memory of either experience. The vague familiarity she felt with the landscape and with the Gulf Coast environment suggested that perhaps her human life had been spent in this area. But recognition never came and memories never surfaced, regardless of how many streets she walked or how many buildings she examined in hopes that something would trigger recollection or would provide clue about who Mary Alice Brandon had been. She saw the Brandon family through her visions without recognizing them as her own family. Her precognitive sight showing her their lives and their futures without providing any indication that they were connected to her or that they had any relationship to the vampire who was searching desperately for identity and for belonging. The years between her transformation in 1920 and her eventual meeting with Jasper in 1948 stretched across nearly 3 decades of solitary existence, guided only by visions and sustained only by hunting that gradually became less frequent and less necessary as she aged beyond newborn intensity, and as her control improved through practice and through conscious effort. She taught herself to move among humans without revealing her nature, watching people carefully and imitating their behaviors and their speech patterns and their mannerisms, until she could pass for human in casual interactions that did not involve physical contact or close examination. The learning was slow and was imperfect, but her determination to understand humanity and to integrate herself into human society came from desperate need for connection and from desperate need to feel like she belonged somewhere, even if that somewhere was human world that could never truly accept her. The development of personality and of identity from nothing, when you have no foundation and no memory required, conscious choices about who she wanted to be and how she wanted to exist in the world. She chose optimism because darkness felt too heavy to carry, when she had no past to anchor her and no future that seemed to offer anything beyond endless repetition of hunting and hiding. She chose cheerfulness because despair was too easy and too consuming. The deliberate cultivation of positive outlook, serving as defense against the emptiness that threatened to overwhelm her when she contemplated eternity without identity and without belonging. The personality she created was artificial initially. The cheerfulness performed rather than felt, and the optimism manufactured rather than natural. But performance eventually became reality as she practiced being the person she had decided to become, and as that persona became integrated into her self-concept. The name Alice felt right, though she did not know if it had been her human name, or if it was simply sound that resonated with something deep in her consciousness that transformation had not quite erased. She began using the name when introducing herself to humans during the brief interactions that her need for connection occasionally required. The act of naming herself giving her identity where none had existed, and giving her foundation where memory had left only blankness. The choice to be Alice rather than to be Mary Alice or to be some other name entirely was arbitrary but was also definitive. The decision-marking moment when she stopped waiting to remember who she had been and started creating who she would be from the possibilities that remained available to vampire who had lost everything but had survived nonetheless. The vision that would change everything and would provide purpose where there had been only survival came sometime in the middle 1940s, approximately 25 or 26 years after her transformation, when she had learned to exist as vampire and had learned to control her thirst, but had not yet found meaning beyond mere continuation of existence that seemed pointless without destination and without goal. The vision showed her blonde vampire with scars covering his arms and his neck, the marks indicating history of violence and indicating participation in vampire conflicts that had left permanent evidence on his immortal body. She understood immediately and instinctively that this vampire was significant to her future and was connected to her destiny in ways that exceeded chance encounter or casual meeting. The vision carrying weight and carrying certainty that marked it as transformative rather than as simply informative about one possible future among many. The vision of the scarred vampire expanded beyond the initial glimpse of his appearance to reveal the complete context of their meeting and to reveal the life they would build together and the family they would join in partnership that would define her existence in ways that solitary wandering never could. She saw the meeting with perfect clarity, the location and the timing and the exact words she would speak when he entered the diner where she would be waiting for him with 2 cups of coffee that neither of them could drink, but that would serve as symbol of her foreknowledge and as demonstration that she had been expecting him and had been preparing for his arrival. The vision showed her Philadelphia diner in 1948, the specific establishment and the specific counter where she would sit, and the specific moment when he would walk through the door exhausted and lost, and seeking something he could not name but that she would provide through her certainty and through her love. Beyond the initial meeting, the visions showed her the scarred vampire's name, and showed her his history, and showed her the pain he carried from decades of violence and from decades of feeling every death and every fear through empathic ability that made him suffer for the suffering he caused. Jasper Whitlock had been transformed during the Civil War and had been used by a vampire named Maria to create and to command newborn armies in the Southern Vampire Wars, where territory and feeding grounds were contested through violence that destroyed countless vampires and countless humans who were caught in conflicts they could not understand and could not survive. His gift of feeling and manipulating emotions made him valuable to Maria, but also made him tortured by the constant exposure to fear and to pain and to death that characterized newborn existence and that characterized the wars he had helped to wage for decades before finally escaping with his brother Peter to seek different existence and different purpose beyond endless violence. The visions showed Alice that Jasper was vegetarian when she would meet him, or was attempting to become vegetarian through his own efforts and through his own moral reckoning with the violence he had committed during his decades with Maria. The struggle he experienced with animal blood diet was visible in her visions. His century of drinking human blood, making the transition difficult and making his control tenuous in ways that created constant temptation to return to easier and more satisfying feeding that his conscience could no longer tolerate. She saw his guilt and saw his self-loathing and saw his desperate search for redemption that he did not believe existed, but that he pursued anyway, because continuing his previous existence had become impossible. Once he had recognized the full horror of what he had done and what he had been during his years in the Vampire Wars. The vision extended beyond Jasper to show Alice the Cullen family that they would join together in 1950, the golden-eyed vampires who lived differently from any other coven she had encountered, in her visions of vampire world. Carlisle Cullen was ancient vampire who had chosen compassion over violence and who had developed vegetarian lifestyle centuries before. Other vampires had considered the possibility that animal blood could sustain them and could allow them to exist among humans without being murderers and without being monsters who destroyed the people they were pretending to be. His creation of family rather than traditional coven represented revolutionary approach to vampire existence, the emphasis on emotional bonds and on mutual support, and on permanent relationships exceeding the typical vampire patterns of solitary existence or temporary alliances based on convenience rather than on genuine affection. Esme Cullen was Carlisle's mate and was the heart of the family, her maternal nature and her capacity for love creating warmth and creating stability that held the coven together through difficulties and through the challenges that vegetarian lifestyle presented to vampires whose instincts demanded human blood and whose nature made killing humans easier and more natural than the constant restraint that animal diet required. Edward Cullen was the mind reader, whose gift allowed him to hear thoughts of everyone around him, and whose brooding nature came from decades of knowing too much about human darkness and about human evil, that his telepathy forced him to witness constantly. Rosalie and Emmett Cullen were mated pair whose relationship provided balance between Rosalie's bitterness about vampire existence and Emmett's joy at vampire abilities, their partnership demonstrating that love could survive transformation and could provide meaning even when immortality stole other sources of purpose and other sources of satisfaction. The vision of joining this family and of belonging to permanent coven and of having home and having identity beyond solitary wanderer created hope that Alice had not experienced since awakening, with no memory and with no foundation for understanding who she was or what she was meant to become. The future she saw included acceptance and included love and included purpose that went beyond survival and went beyond the empty continuation of existence that had characterized her decades of wandering. She saw herself as part of something larger and as part of something meaningful, the family structure providing the belonging she had desperately sought, since transformation had erased her human connections and had left her utterly alone in a world she did not understand and could not navigate without guidance or without support. The vision showed her that reaching this future would require preparation and would require changes to her current existence. The golden eyes of the Cullen family indicating that they survived on animal blood exclusively and that joining them would require her to abandon human blood permanently rather than temporarily. The realization that she had 2 years to prepare before meeting Jasper in 1948 gave her concrete goal and gave her specific timeline that made the abstract future feel achievable and feel real in ways that vague hopes about eventual belonging never could. She began planning immediately, her precognitive ability showing her the steps she would need to take and the changes she would need to make to transform herself from solitary killer into vampire who could join the Cullens and could become part of their family without bringing danger or bringing disruption that would threaten their careful existence. The transition to animal blood diet was excruciating and was more difficult than Alice had anticipated, even though her visions had shown her the process and had shown her the struggle that lay ahead. Her first attempts to hunt animals instead of humans were clumsy and were frustrating. the comparative weakness of animal blood, making her feel unsatisfied and making her thirst burn constantly in ways that human blood would have eliminated immediately and completely. The deer and the mountain lions and the other prey animals she hunted provided sustenance but provided nothing like the satisfaction that human blood had given her, the fundamental difference in quality and in potency, making vegetarian diet feel like starvation, even though her body was receiving sufficient nutrition to sustain her vampire existence. The temptation to return to human blood was overwhelming during the early weeks and months of her transition. Every human she encountered calling to her thirst and calling to her instincts in ways that required constant conscious effort to resist. She saw through her visions the humans she would kill if she gave in to temptation. The precognitive sight showing her their deaths and their families' grief and the guilt she would feel afterward when the feeding frenzy ended and when she could see clearly what she had done. The visions of her own future also showed her that returning to human blood would prevent her from joining the Cullens and would prevent her from meeting Jasper and would condemn her to continued solitary existence without the belonging and without the love that waited for her if she could maintain the vegetarian diet long enough to prove herself worthy of joining the family she had seen in her visions. Her throat burned constantly during the transition period, the animal blood insufficient to completely satisfy vampire thirst in ways that made every day feel like struggle and made every moment require decision to continue the diet rather than to abandon it for easier existence and for more immediate satisfaction. But her visions of the future sustained her through the difficulty and sustained her through the temptation, the certainty that vegetarian lifestyle would lead to belonging and would lead to family, making the present suffering bearable and making the sacrifice feel worthwhile when she could see the destination, even though the path remained difficult. She persisted through months that became a year and then became nearly 2 years of animal blood diet that gradually became more tolerable and gradually became sustainable as her body adjusted and as her thirst intensity decreased from newborn levels to more manageable levels that allowed for greater control. The preparation extended beyond dietary changes to include learning how to exist among humans in ways that would allow her to integrate into human society and would allow her to maintain the pretense that the Cullens required for their permanent residence in human communities. She studied human behavior with intensity that exceeded her previous casual observations, watching people carefully and noting their speech patterns and their gestures and their social interactions that she would need to replicate convincingly when she joined the Cullens and when she participated in their cover as family, attending school and participating in community activities. The 1940s post-war culture was different from the early 20th century culture she had been part of as human, even though she could not remember that earlier era consciously. The social changes that had occurred during her vampire decades, requiring her to learn current norms and current expectations, rather than relying on instincts or memories that no longer existed. Fashion became particular interest during her preparation years, her visions showing her future trends and showing her styles that would become popular before they became mainstream and before human designers had created them. The ability to see future fashion allowed her to stay ahead of trends and allowed her to develop aesthetic sense that would later become one of her defining characteristics and would become one of her contributions to Cullen family life. She experimented with clothing and with accessories and with different presentations of herself. The process of choosing appearance and choosing style, representing the creation of identity through external markers, when internal identity remained fragmentary and remained constructed rather than remembered. The personality she cultivated during these preparation years was consciously chosen rather than naturally developed. Her decision to be optimistic and to be cheerful and to be loving, coming from her understanding through visions that these qualities would make her valuable to the Cullens and would make her integration into the family smoother and more successful. The cheerfulness that would later seem natural and seem effortless was initially performance and was initially effort. Her practice of positive outlook and positive affect gradually becoming habitual and gradually becoming integrated into her self-concept as she repeated the behaviors and repeated the attitudes until they felt genuine rather than feeling artificial. She chose joy deliberately because her visions showed her that darkness and bitterness would alienate her from the family she wanted to join and would create barriers that would prevent the belonging she desperately sought. The name Alice became definitive during this period, rather than remaining tentative or remaining placeholder for identity she might someday recover. She claimed the name fully and claimed the identity she was creating rather than waiting for memories that would never return, and rather than hoping for past that was permanently lost to her. The act of choosing to be Alice Cullen even before she had met the Cullens or had been formally accepted into their family represented commitment to the future she had seen and represented rejection of the past she could not remember. The forward focus allowing her to move beyond the grief of lost identity and allowing her to embrace the possibilities that remained available despite transformation's destruction of her human memories. The years from 1946 through 1948 passed in focused preparation and impatient waiting. Her knowledge of exactly when and where she would meet Jasper, making the time feel less endless and making her existence feel less purposeless than it had felt during her previous decades of wandering. She moved gradually toward Philadelphia as 1948 approached, her visions guiding her movements and guiding her timing to ensure she would arrive at the correct location at the correct moment when Jasper would walk into the diner seeking something he could not name, but that she would provide through her certainty and through her welcome. The anticipation built as the date approached. Her excitement about finally meeting the vampire she had seen in her visions, and her excitement about beginning the journey toward the Cullens and toward the belonging she had sought. Since awakening with no memory and no identity, making the final months of waiting feel longer and feel more difficult than the previous years had felt. The preparation of her appearance for the meeting was meticulous and was carefully considered. Her choice of clothing and her choice of presentation, designed to make immediate positive impression and designed to communicate that she was confident and was prepared and was worthy of his attention despite being vampire he had never met, and despite her approach being unexpected and being based on visions he would not initially understand. She arrived in Philadelphia days before the scheduled meeting, her visions showing her the exact diner and the exact counter seat where she needed to wait, and the exact moment when Jasper would arrive exhausted from his journey and desperate for direction and for purpose that his escape from Maria had failed to provide. The 2 cups of coffee she ordered were symbolic and were practical. the beverages serving as props that would demonstrate her foreknowledge and that would prove to Jasper that she had been expecting him specifically, rather than simply being vampire who happened to be present when he arrived. The coffee cups sat steaming on the counter in front of her, while she waited with supernatural patience, her precognitive ability allowing her to know exactly when he would walk through the door and allowing her to prepare her expression and her greeting for the moment that would mark the beginning of her real existence and the beginning of her journey toward belonging that had been her goal since she first saw him in her visions years earlier. Jasper's arrival was exactly as she had foreseen, his exhaustion visible in his posture and his confusion visible in his expression when he saw her sitting at the counter with 2 coffee cups and with a smile that suggested she knew him despite his certainty that they had never met before. His empathic ability felt her emotions immediately, the genuine joy and the genuine love that radiated from her, making him stop and making him stare despite his confusion about who she was and about why she was looking at him with such familiarity and such affection. She spoke the words she had practiced for years, her voice warm and her tone certain when she said, "You have kept me waiting a long time," the greeting communicating both her foreknowledge and her acceptance and her commitment to him, despite the impossibility of their situation and despite the strangeness of meeting that required explanation he could not immediately provide. His shock at being expected was visible and was profound. Jasper's empathic ability confirming that her emotions were genuine and were directed specifically at him, despite the impossibility of her knowing him or knowing his arrival time or knowing anything about his journey from the south toward Philadelphia, where he had been wandering without destination and without purpose beyond escaping the violence and escaping the guilt that followed him from his decades with Maria. Alice's explanation tumbled out quickly and tumbled out joyfully, her words describing the visions that had shown her his face and had shown her their meeting and had shown her their future together with the Cullens in Cullen that would become their family and would become their permanent home after decades of wandering and after decades of searching for meaning that neither of them had found in solitary existence. She told him about Carlyle and about Esme and about Edward and about Rosalie and Emmett, her descriptions of the family members she had never met coming from years of watching them through her visions and from years of understanding their personalities and their relationships through precognitive sight that showed her their futures and showed her how they would welcome the addition of 2 new members to their carefully constructed family. She explained the vegetarian lifestyle and explained the golden eyes that marked the Cullens as different from other vampires and that marked them as choosing compassion over convenience and choosing restraint over indulgence in ways that most vampire world considered weakness or considered foolishness, but that Alice knew represented strength and represented genuine moral choice that Jasper had been seeking without knowing where to find it. His bewilderment was understandable and was visible in his expression. The concept of vampire who could see the future being unusual enough, but the concept of vampire who had seen him specifically and had been waiting for him for years being nearly incomprehensible to someone whose experience of vampire world had been characterized by violence and by betrayal and by relationships based on utility rather than based on genuine affection or genuine connection. But his empathic ability confirmed what his rational mind struggled to accept. The emotions radiating from Alice being authentic and being powerful in ways that made doubt impossible when he could feel her love and could feel her certainty and could feel her absolute conviction that they belonged together and that their future was already determined through her visions, even though his free will suggested he could choose differently if he wanted to resist. His relief at finding direction and finding purpose through her certainty was immediate and was overwhelming. The decades of searching and the decades of guilt, lifted partially by the possibility that perhaps redemption existed and perhaps meaning could be found in the vegetarian lifestyle and in the family structure that Alice described with enthusiasm that exceeded anything Jasper had experienced in his century of existence. The coffee cups between them served their symbolic purpose, the props demonstrating her foreknowledge and demonstrating that she had prepared for his arrival with care and with attention to details that proved her visions were accurate and were reliable in ways that made trusting her easier and made accepting her guidance more reasonable than continuing his aimless wandering would have been. Their departure from Philadelphia together marked the beginning of partnership that would define both of their existences across the decades that followed. Jasper's empathic ability and Alice's precognitive ability complementing each other and creating bond that exceeded normal vampire relationships and that approached the mate bonds that characterize the most successful vampire partnerships. The journey toward the Cullens required time and required preparation because Jasper's transition to vegetarian diet needed to occur before they could join the family and before they could present themselves as committed to the lifestyle that defined the Cullens and that distinguished them from typical vampires whose feeding habits made them dangerous to humans and made them unable to integrate into human society in the ways that permanent residence required. Jasper's struggle with animal blood diet was more severe than Alice's struggle had been. His century of drinking human blood and his decades of drinking from newborns whose blood was particularly potent, making the transition to animal blood feel like starvation and feel like torture, that he barely endured despite Alice's support and despite his genuine desire to change his feeding habits and to leave behind the violence that had characterized his existence since his transformation during the Civil War. His empathic ability magnified his difficulty because he could feel the animals' fear and could feel their pain when he hunted them. The emotional feedback creating guilt and creating distress that human prey had never created because his decades of violence had numbed him to human suffering in ways that animal suffering somehow penetrated despite being less complex and less profound than human emotional experience. Alice's patience during his adjustment period was infinite and was unwavering, her visions showing her that he would eventually succeed and that he would eventually master the vegetarian lifestyle, even though the present struggle seemed overwhelming and seemed impossible to overcome when every hunt left him unsatisfied and every moment brought temptation to return to easier feeding that his conscience could no longer tolerate. She encouraged him when he wanted to give up, and she reminded him of the future she had seen when present difficulties made that future seem unreachable, her certainty providing foundation, when his own conviction wavered, and when his own strength seemed insufficient for the changes he was attempting to make. The teaching they provided each other created balance in their relationship and created mutual dependence that strengthened their bond. Alice teaching Jasper about vegetarian lifestyle and about hope for redemption, while Jasper taught Alice about vampire world and about vampire history, and about the structures and the politics and the dangers that she had never fully understood. During her solitary decades of wandering without guidance or without context for her existence, his knowledge of the Southern Vampire Wars and his knowledge of Maria's methods and his knowledge of newborn armies provided Alice with understanding of vampire violence and vampire conflict that her visions had shown her, but that she had not comprehended fully without explanation from someone who had lived through those experiences and who had participated in that violence firsthand. His stories of his past atrocities were shared honestly and were shared completely. Jasper's recognition that hiding his history would create false foundation for their relationship, making him willing to reveal the full extent of his crimes and the full extent of his guilt. Despite knowing that the revelations might make Alice reject him or might make her reconsider their partnership. But Alice's acceptance of his history was immediate and was absolute. Her focus on his future rather than on his past, reflecting her own experience of having no past to judge him by, and her own conviction that identity was created through choices rather than through history, and that redemption was possible for anyone willing to make different choices and willing to commit to different existence than what they had known before. The traveling across country from Philadelphia toward the Pacific Northwest, where the Cullens were currently residing, took months of gradual movement, punctuated by hunting stops and by Jasper's continued struggle with vegetarian diet that improved slowly but improved steadily as his body adjusted and as his control developed through practice and through Alice's patient support. She used her visions to track the Cullens' movements as they relocated, according to their established pattern of moving every few years to avoid detection, when unchanging appearances made extended residence impossible in single community. Her precognitive ability showing her where the family would be and when they would be there, and allowing her to time their arrival for moment when the Cullens would be most receptive to accepting new members and most open to expanding their family structure. Jasper's nervousness about meeting the Cullens intensified as they approached the Pacific Northwest, and as the meeting became imminent, rather than remaining distant future that could be worried about later. His violent past made him doubt whether vampires who had chosen compassion and chosen restraint for centuries would accept someone whose existence had been defined by violence and whose transformation into vegetarian was recent and was still precarious when control remained difficult and when temptation remained constant. Alice's reassurance that she had seen their acceptance and had seen their welcome in her visions provided some comfort, but could not entirely eliminate his anxiety about judgment and about rejection from vampires whose moral standards exceeded anything he had achieved, and whose lifestyle represented ideals he was only beginning to approach through his faltering attempts at vegetarian existence. The year 1950 arrived with their journey nearing completion, and with their introduction to the Cullens approaching, according to Alice's visions that showed her the exact timing and the exact circumstances of their arrival at the Cullen house in location somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, where the family had settled temporarily. The approach to the house was nerve-wracking for Jasper. Despite Alice's confidence, and despite her repeated assurances that everything would proceed exactly as she had foreseen, his century of vampire politics and vampire violence making him cautious about entering another vampire's territory without invitation, and making him aware that their unannounced arrival could be interpreted as threat or could be interpreted as challenge that would require a response from Carlyle as coven leader. But Alice's certainty overrode his caution and overrode his instinct to announce themselves formally or to request permission before approaching. Her knowledge that they were expected, even though the Cullens did not yet know they were expected, making her comfortable with simply arriving and simply introducing themselves as if their addition to the family had already been decided and already been accepted. Edward's telepathic ability detected their approach before they reached the door, his reading of their thoughts providing the Cullens with advance warning and providing them with understanding of Alice's visions and of Jasper's hopes before actual introductions could occur and before explanations could be offered through normal verbal communication. Carlyle opened the door with expression of gentle curiosity rather than suspicion or hostility, his centuries of existence making him comfortable with unusual situations and making him interested in vampires whose arrival had been foreseen by one of them and whose intentions seemed peaceful, based on Edward's reading of their thoughts. Alice's greeting was bright and was enthusiastic. Her explanation of her visions and her introduction of Jasper flowing naturally and flowing confidently, as if she were rejoining family she had temporarily left rather than meeting strangers for the first time. Her knowledge of each family member, despite never having met them, was demonstrated through her use of their names and through her references to recent events she had seen through her visions. The proof of her precognitive ability evident in ways that made explanations unnecessary and made acceptance easier. The family's reaction to Alice and Jasper was cautious but was welcoming. Carlyle's fascination with Alice's precognitive ability and Carlyle's compassion for Jasper's struggle with vegetarian lifestyle overriding any reservations about accepting new members whose presence would change family dynamics and whose addition would require adjustments to establish patterns and establish relationships. Esme's maternal warmth extended immediately to both newcomers, her instinct to nurture and her instinct to include making her advocate for their acceptance even before the family had formally discussed whether to invite them to join permanently. Edward's ability to read their thoughts provided assurance that their intentions were genuine and provided understanding of Alice's visions that showed futures where they were integrated into the family and where their presence strengthened rather than weakened the bonds that held the Cullens together. Rosalie's suspicion and Emmett's friendly curiosity represented the range of reactions that new members always generated in established groups. Rosalie's protective instinct making her cautious about changes that might threaten family stability, while Emmett's openness made him willing to accept newcomers based on first impressions, rather than requiring extensive evaluation or requiring proof of commitment beyond what Alice and Jasper had already demonstrated through their arrival and through their obvious dedication to vegetarian lifestyle that Jasper was still mastering. The family discussion about whether to accept them as permanent members was brief because Alice's visions provided certainty about positive outcomes and because Carlyle's leadership style emphasized inclusion rather than emphasizing exclusion when vampires sought to join their unusual family structure. The moment of acceptance was simple and was definitive. Carlyle's invitation for them to stay and to join the family marking transition from wandering outsiders to belonging members of Cullen that would become their permanent home and would become their identity across the decades that followed. Alice's vision had been fulfilled completely and had been fulfilled exactly as she had foreseen years earlier when she first saw Jasper's scarred face and first understood that he represented her future and represented her belonging in ways that solitary existence had never provided and could never provide, regardless of how many years she survived or how many centuries she endured without connection and without family. So rest now, sleepy souls, with Alice's forgotten story complete from birth in Biloxi to asylum confinement to transformation that erased everything and left her with nothing but visions of futures she could never fully control and memories of pasts she could never access. Mary Alice Brandon lived 19 years before becoming the vampire who remembered nothing of those years. The girl who could see everyone's future but lost her own past forever when venom rewrote her mind and destroyed the neural pathways that had contained her identity and her history and her connections to family who had abandoned her and to world that had rejected her. She created herself from visions rather than from memories, chose optimism over despair, chose belonging over bitterness, and found family not through blood, but through foresight and through love that transcended loss and transcended the emptiness where identity should have been. Sleep knowing that sometimes forgetting is mercy, that futures we build matter more than pasts we have lost, and that identity can be chosen when memory fails and when history offers nothing but pain that serves no purpose beyond creating suffering that cannot be healed. Rest now, knowing that even the most incomplete stories can have beautiful continuations, that family can be found when blood family fails, and that who we choose to become matters infinitely more than who we were before we learned to choose at all. Good night.